you can't possibly know what you want to do next until you've stopped doing what you're doing now. If you have a plan, it's better than not having a plan. And if everyone follows one plan, then you've got more chance of making some progress than everyone following a different bit of their own plan.
Now, today's guest is a force of nature. From running election campaigns for Tony Blair to revamping Pudsey Bear. From heading marketing at Radio 1 during its transformation years to leading one of London's top advertising agencies.
We decided we wanted to do something impactful together. We didn't know what that would be. He'd just come back from the UN taking this massive brief to launch the Sustainable Development Goals, but he didn't know how to do that. He just knew it was a good idea. I think if your resting position or your outlook on the world is, oh, but what if that doesn't happen? Or what if my start point is always, gosh, it'll be amazing when that happened. Imagine if that happened.
Gail Gallie has done what many dream of. Built a career fueled by creativity, impact, and courage.
I'm hugely optimistic in the power of people. I feel like if you're looking at things that are going on in the world right now that you're not happy with, it's always really important to remember that there'll be many, many, many millions of people who are also not happy, even though their leader might be doing something.
So in today's episode, you'll hear about Gail's unconventional path, her love of big ideas, and even bigger risks. This really is a masterclass in doing well by doing good. So let's dive right in. Here's Gail Gallie.
So today's episode is of course brought to you by two fantastic organisations. The first, Studio Space, a leading on-demand marketing agency platform. This enables marketers to browse and brief agencies, receive proposals and start work all in one place. It's literally like having your own agency network at your fingertips, without the hassle, as they take care of everything from contracting, invoicing, procurement to legal. So check out Studio Space today. Our other sponsor, of course, is the Marketing Skills Trust, a charity whose mission is to make the marketing industry a better place, providing grants to help create a more equitable industry and help us to level up. The Marketing Skills Trust has been instrumental in championing a more inclusive, diverse and open marketing industry. You can find out more by going to their website. Okay, let's get on with the show.
Hey Gail, how's it going? Lovely to have you on.
Thank you.
So let's dive right in. You've done a plethora of different things. In fact, in the green room, you're talking about the fact that, you do a range of different things as opposed to a one big job type of thing. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about your career and maybe give us a little bit of the blotted history of the journey so far.
Sure. God, it gets longer and longer, doesn't it? The older one gets. I think in a nutshell, I've always liked communicating. That has been the thread. Nothing was planned. I went to university to study languages, just because that was fun. I had no intention of working. What do you work as a languagist? A translator? I guess that's also about language. I do. Indeed. So probably a good job I didn't pursue that. But I came out of university, or rather I was ending my time at university broke and needing a job. I think I would have at that time said I wanted to go into television, probably journalism or news. I used to look like Anna Ford, old reference of a newsreader that I just thought looked terrifically glamorous at all times. I'm fascinated by newsreaders, actually. I absolutely love studying how quickly they can go from bad news to good news and bad again, and that pivot. I might do my impersonation of Fiona Bruce later, if you're lucky. But I needed a job, and it seemed to me that the only way you could get a job in television was you had to be able to volunteer, therefore you had to have money or a flat in London. I had none of those things. So there were 3 milk rounds going around university when I was there. The legal profession, well, I hadn't studied law, so that didn't seem right. The finance profession, never been any good at money or interested, or advertising. And that seemed to me to be quite close to television. So I went for some of those things, got 2 jobs, chose one that was in central London, and off I went. So I did advertising for probably about 5 years, fell into political advertising about halfway through that, was lucky enough to work with the incoming Tony Blair campaign, so ran the ads for the election campaign that got him elected in 1997. That was a happy, heady time. And that really switched me into the media. And so I got even closer to television, but not quite. So I went to radio. I wrote to Radio 1 to say, I love music. Can I have a job? And they said, yes, you can come and be the head of marketing, which was news to me. But they just looked at a career and I think it said, oh, advertising, marketing, that must be quite similar. It isn't. I mean, it is, but it's not the same thing. So I was gloriously incompetent at that for a while. But I did love music. That was true. And so I sort of surfed a wave of being the youngest person in a marketing leading position to rejuvenate the Radio 1 brand. That was the job. Radio 1 had got really old. And so that was a joy. That was a proper alignment of time, values, passion, and the job. So I stayed at Radio 1 for stayed at the BBC for 10 years, but ended up growing up there and running marketing for news and for sport and for online, all sorts of things. And then jumped out of that in a slightly career-ending way because I just had this feeling of, I know everything that's happening in the BBC, but I don't know what I'm doing. You know, I'm a builder. You know, I like to make things happen. And I was in a lot of meetings. I mean, I don't know if you've seen W1A, that comedy show. It's absolutely true. And so you can be in meetings and go, yep, no, yeah, absolutely, across that. And but what am I doing? You know, so I walked out and did some consulting around brand and how could you transform brands, and I definitely was leaning in towards the brands that I think sort of mattered. So I did, but we're also quite playful actually. So I think I'm a combination of purposeful and playful. So I redid Pudsey Bear. Great fun. Made Pudsey smile. Gave him some friends. Gave him a girlfriend. I worked on Sport Relief to rejuvenate that brand and came up with that idea of just do sport, do good, because it was getting all quite complicated, I think. And then I had a sort of weird detour back into the advertising industry serendipitously, because the agency I'd worked with so much and so deeply and I loved working with were Fallon. I'd sort of started that agency as their first client and I'd stayed there for 10 years. And my first boss in advertising called up and said, I really need a CEO to run Fallon. They'd just been bought by Publicis. I thought, amazing. What's not to like about being a CEO? The more accurate would have been what's not to know about being a CEO. As it turns out, in my case, quite a lot. But I gave it a good go for 4 years, half of which was brilliant, half of which was, I'd say a disaster. But you know, there I was, and then did another career-ending move of leaving there, open to the universe. I think you'd say, like, let's see what happens. I know I don't want that. I don't know what I want, but let's see what happens. And then I had this sort of incredible serendipity of, through my great friend Kate Garvey, who had also just left a big media job in Freud's, we decided we wanted to do something impactful together. We didn't know what that would be. She had worked before with Richard Curtis for Make Poverty History and Live 8. I had sort of worked with him with Sport Relief, but not too much directly. He'd just come back from the UN taking this massive brief to launch the Sustainable Development Goals, but he didn't know how to do that. He just knew it was a good idea. And he called up Kate and said, what do you think? And Kate said, well, I think it sounds interesting. Meet my friend Gail. You know, we've been talking about doing something interesting. And thus we were born, Project Everyone. So I've been doing that for 10 years, and now I've heaved again, because I'm obviously can't do anything for 10 minutes, let alone 10 years, without changing it up. So I'm now on the board of Project Everyone, and I've started a sort of, what would you call it? It's a sort of venture studio to do with climate and nature. So I'm really focusing in on the climate and nature space and bringing in all I can, network, you know, philanthropy, investment to, and I think powered by creativity always, to really try and accelerate some progress for the world in terms of our climate and the natural environment, because boy, does it need it. And that's us. That's up to date. That's up to date.
Wow. I think I probably need a little bit of a lie down having heard all that. It's
Me too.
Like the Pudsey, Sports Relief, Tony Blair, Radio 1, so many accolades. You said career ending. I think probably career beginning in a way.
You say that, but at the time, you know, I was there. I was riding so hard. I had it all. I had a BBC, a final salary pension, like, you know, perfect. I was swanky. I had, you know, I had a taxi account. I'm from Newcastle. You know, this was the life, and the career ended because I was a bit sort of bored. It's like, I don't know what I'm doing.
But to live a life less ordinary. I did a flip out of the corporate thing a couple of years ago, and I describe is a fruit salad. It's tasty, it's varied, it's delicious, it's healthy. Not as pompous as the whole portfolio thing. But I just we'll get onto Project Everyone, and we'll really go into that, because that, I think, is really the epicenter of what we want to talk about today. But that word playful, it really jumped out to me, and it almost seems like you hold your whole career quite lightly, almost in a sort of a playful sense. Tell us what a playful career means to you.
Interesting that I did use that word, because I'm not sure I ever have. You've obviously inspired something in me, Mark, in a reflective sense. But I do hold myself very lightly. That is true, and it's said to me quite often that I hold my career, my intellect, quite lightly. I mean, there are things I don't hold lightly, like my friends and my family. I'm like a lion to make sure that they're protected and good. But I do hold some of the heavier stuff in life, I suppose, quite lightly, because I believe that that's the way you stay open, and that's the way, therefore, that you're going to be able to be the best partner, be the best be the most curious mind. Because what I really don't like being fixed, and I find it frustrating when I'm not very good at rules, and I'm not very good at when people say, well, you just can't do that because that's just not what happens. And I feel like, therefore, I have to live a value which is open and curious, and that does lead to playfulness. Maybe I'm just a bit silly. I don't know. I find it very difficult to. I'm very optimistic. I'm generally quite a resting, happy person. I've always felt very, very lucky that is my basic mindset, as one of optimism and cheer. I also believe in it as a tool and a tactic. So I guess all that bundles up, and it gets you to playful.
And I think fascinating, and for me, and one of the things that I took away as well from that meandering tour of your career was the thought that there were moments in time when you talk and you classify them as career ending, and yet you were willing to take the chance. You didn't necessarily have the next steps carved out. You didn't know what you were going to then go on to do, and most people would, and perhaps even good advice, maybe fly in the face of good advice, is when you kind of go, well, make sure you have your next step before you take the leap of faith, sort of thing. And that wasn't quite part of your repertoire. And I wonder how you thought about that at that moment and were willing to take those chances and those risks. What gave you the characteristics? What gave you the sense that you could then, you would find the next branch, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. When I mentor people, I always say, you can't possibly know what you want to do next until you've stopped doing what you're doing now. Because I'm the sort of direct opposite of planning the next move. I'm also a horrific risk taker. I mean, how I am still alive, I do not know. I have, and then I'll tell you a funny anecdote. My husband and I once tried to do some sensible financial planning, and the guy we both went to see individually, when you go and see these men who live in, Savile Row, posh parts of London with suits on, and he concluded he couldn't possibly work for us because our risk profiles were so different. So as in, my husband is an extremely steady architect, rational. It's good. He builds buildings for a living, and therefore they must not fall down and kill people. So it's important that he understands risk properly. I honestly sometimes think I've just been born with a gene missing, and it's the one that worries about not knowing what's going to happen. I'm really good at that, despite being an immense control freak when it comes to certain aspects of my work, particularly, in terms of like making sure that the dinner is going to go exactly as I want it to, and I want the right people in the room, and I'm an emotional control freak. I want everyone to feel happy. I'm an outcome control freak. Like, I want the best to happen that can happen, and yet at the same time, I'm incredibly comfortable with risk. I don't even see it as risk. I say with hindsight, career ending potentially. I was so convinced in my core at that point that I had to not go back to advertising, that I had to leave the BBC and allow other things to open up for me. I just don't see it. Making me say I'm really good at risk sounds like I'm brave. I'm not really. I'm just a little bit stupid in terms of high risk behaviors, and also I think if you put optimism in there, then you can do it. You need to be optimistic. I think if your resting position or your outlook on the world is, but what if that doesn't happen? Or what if, my start point is always, gosh, it'll be amazing when that happened. Imagine if that happened. And I think that's important when you think about the kind of work I now do, which is trying to lead people into action, which isn't necessarily going to be easy action or secure or known outcome actions about climate change and nature. I believe the way to get there is optimism and painting the picture of what could be. And it's actually been the privilege of my life to work with Richard Curtis for 10 years, because I've never met anyone more like that than I am. And he's like that on steroids. And that's not to say he's not grounded in deep thought and rationale, but his power of optimism is kind of extraordinary, and it's amazing to work around. And I believe that that's the most potent lever I've got for change. But do not put me in charge of an investment portfolio, because it would be an absolute fucking disaster.
Well, we are going to go into Project Everyone. Just to note a couple of things before I do. I think what I've gleaned is which decisions to take lightly and which decisions to take
Maybe,
left.
yeah.
And also something around backing yourself. I'm also a pathological optimist, much to my wife's significant annoyance many times. But there's this mentality that I think you have, not to impose it upon you, but you can't necessarily know it's the right decision, but you can back yourself to make it right. And that takes the pressure off the decision itself. Anyway, let's not wait any longer before getting into Project Everyone. You've tipped a wink towards it. For those people who have maybe not really that familiar, maybe there's some, it'd be great just to start with. Just give us a description of Everyone.
Sure. So Project Everyone deliberately was not meant to be known. So that's why most people probably won't know us, because we set ourselves up to deliver a different brand, the brand of the SDGs. Project Everyone it's just a code name that Richard made up at the time, because we were trying to get the UN's goals to everyone. And of course, we spent 6 months going, must remember to change the name, must remember to get a sensible name for ourselves. And, lo and behold, 10 years later, there it is, with the same logo that I think we did on a PowerPoint, and it's Richard's handwriting. So it's like we really must get around to doing something about that. But it was a communications unit set up to, in effect, make a brand out of what was going to be a pretty standard policy document. It was a great policy document, but it's long and it's wordy, and it details 17 sustainable development goals with targets and indicators. And Richard's vision was, this will be much more successful if we can make it look and feel like a brand, like something people want to engage with, that children can get inspired by, that will travel all over the world. And so we set to work branding it. And then it's a sort of multidisciplinary communications unit of incredibly talented, committed young people. It's about 35 people now, majority female, always been female-led. And we put the power of communications behind the SDGs, is what we say. And really what we're trying to do is drive awareness of those goals in circles that matter. And those circles can be world leaders, business leaders, policymakers, activists, educators, children. So it's a broad audience that we're targeting, but it's always targeting people who can take those goals into their lives or their work and do something about them. So we want people to be aware of them. We want people to have affinity with them, and then we want people to take action. So we work on a kind of AAA model. And when we launched them, we sort of ludicrously, brilliantly, ignorant and playfully decided, let's try and reach 7 billion people with these goals in 7 days. I like alliteration. I also have terrible memory, so things need to either rhyme or alliterate. So 7 billion, 7 days. And we brought in incredible friends, network partners. I think people were charmed by the ludicrousness of the ask. Oh, hello, we're ringing up from the United Nations and Richard Curtis. Would you like to make the world a bit better and help us reach 7 billion people? So we've had amazing lean-ins from, massive organizations, sponsors, foundations, Liverpool Football Club, the Royal Mail. Most people said yes, because we were asking them for such a big lift. I think if we'd said we'd like to reach 25% of under 50, people would have put us on a list with all the other things that need to get done. There was something very simple about what we were asking. And then you apply that sort of ask, you dress it with a ton of creativity, and you apply it into a network of people that, through someone who knew someone who'd worked somewhere else, we managed to get about half of that. So it was a brilliant failure. We used to say after year one, well done us. We failed to reach 3.5 billion people, but we did reach 3.5 billion. And bearing in mind, we're not Nike. We weren't Unilever. We had no marketing budgets or departments. We were about 10 of us in Richard's office. So it was a good start. And we all really only meant to start Project Everyone as a project, hence its name. But it seemed to work, and one of the biggest sponsors of that first activity, which was the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, said, "What are you doing next? Because we like the way you do this. It's different." And so we suddenly had to think of it next, and as Richard calls it, a difficult second album. But off we went, and we've grown since. So that's what we are. We're a non-profit group of but 35 change makers, multidisciplinary, some campaigners, some creatives, strategists, event people.
The power of purpose, Gail. Jeez, I mean,
The power
infectious.
of purpose, absolutely.
Isn't it amazing? I mean, audacious mixed with a sense of simplicity, which then galvanizes all those around you with minimal purchase power in that sense. I mean, brilliant, right? I mean, this is like a marketer's playbook. This is like a dream sort of brief in that way, or a dream execution, shall we say, in that sense. You know, one of the things that the second we talk about the SDGs, what conjures up is, as you've described it, Richard Curtis's wheel that he drew out in his initial days on stage. And I just wonder if you perhaps could elaborate a little bit more about maybe some of the thinking behind it that solidified that wheel, as it were, as the icon, which has then led to everyone having that great visualization.
Oh, yeah, I can. I mean, it's quite a fun story. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and hearing, but we had, we were thinking we needed to do a design, and Tim Davey, who had been my boss at the BBC, he's now the Director General, but he was my marketing, he was the sort of marketing director when I was on the marketing board. He had said, oh, there's only one designer you must go to. He's called Jakob Trollback. He's done a ton of like TV brands. He's a Swedish guy, but he has a studio in New York. So Richard and I, Julie, I mean, it was literally, we're a little bit like the Wombles. Richard, someone says we must go to New York to meet Jakob. Let's go to New York. So off we go. And I remember being in the Soho House in New York. I mean, honestly, I was like a long way from Newcastle in my head. I was like, this is really swanky. I've massively arrived. And Jakob comes in. He's this really morose Swedish guy who's brilliant and also like quite sort of Swedishly downbeat. And he had some scamps. So he'd done, you know, classic. I was totally in my comfort zone. I've got this. This is advertising 101, right? This is like a tissue meeting. So he shows these routes, and Richard leans into one in particular, which is not the one we ended up with. And it had, and I could tell by the way Jakob had presented them, and anyone who's done a creative presentation knows this rhythm. He absolutely did not want this one to be chosen because it was the one he was trying to bury, building up to the one he wanted. I could sense that, and I kind of agreed with him. I could see where that was going. But Richard had deviated from Jakob's plan, and he'd gone for option 2, not option 3. And it had photography in it, and I knew why Richard was leaning into it. It was because it initially seemed much warmer, because it was much more like comic relief type. There were, you know, children, and so I got it. But I could, thinking of my BBC branding days, I could also think about all the complexity of, oh, which pictures, and, you know, that doesn't replicate well on a baseball cap, and how's that going to look on a lanyard? And so I could see the problems. But then Richard goes to the bathroom, and Jakob leaned in and he went, "It's a fucking disaster." And I was like, okay, I get it. I'm with you. We can get back on track. And of course, Richard is brilliant, and listening, we had a debate and we ended up with the icon. So that's where it came from. That's like a little cute origin story of like what nearly was. Then what was interesting though was the whole wheel concept, because that was pure design. You know, that did not come from the UN. Obviously, it speaks volumes, and this is why Jakob is such a good, thoughtful designer, a strategic designer. It's about the interconnectivity. It's about not only one of them dominates, they actually come together. You had the climate ones, you had the humanitarian ones. You also can put any one in the middle and say it reacts to all the others. And so, you know, it adds so much symbolism and potential. But the tile, which I don't know if you can visualize when you have all 17 and then a wheel at the bottom, the only reason he actually thought of an icon was that 17 is such a crap number. In design terms, it doesn't stack up to anything, right? So he wanted them to look like they could all sit neatly on a card. So it had to have it needed an 18 something. And that's where he got to thinking, okay, what is this? Circle, they can all fit together. So it's one of those brilliantly serendipitous moments, you know, fueled by strategy, but actually in the end, a piece of execution that turned out to be genius, you know, and the wheel is what everyone could then use as a stamp, and we can use it as an O, and, you know, joy flows. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if only it was 16, it would have been much easier. But no,
oh my God, even Richard used to say even God only had 10.
Yes, indeed. But why stop there? No, but all important. So that's with Jakob, that sounded like a key pivot moment.
Yeah.
I suppose there would have been many others, but what was the best of moments and the worst of moments on this epic journey?
Oh, I mean, they will not be and these are not superlatives because there have been so many, and largely immense ups. I mean, as I have to say, as I said earlier, has been the privilege of my working life the last 10 years of being in the center of just seeing all that. I mean, I did very little, but I just being part and seeing how the ebbs and flows of the world from that lens has been amazing. And in terms of running Project Everyone in Moments, I mean, there was a huge high when we finally sort of stood back and saw the projections going up on the UN the night that we launched them. I mean, it had been the most extraordinary journey to get to that night, I think. And, all the, as I say, 7 billion, 7 days, just to be there. And I saw a photo, when you're sort of in something that's so epic and you can't quite believe it, you have like a vague out of body experience. And I almost didn't feel it until I saw a picture of Richard Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General at the time, and Amina Mohammed looking up at the projections. And it was that thing of like, oh my gosh, we actually made that happen. Wow. And then at the end of that was the start of the week. And then the end of that launch week, this is going to sound really name droppy, so apologies, but there's just such a funny visual that goes with it. We'd partnered up with Global Citizen, who were the org who put the concert on at the end of Climate Week every year. And because of Richard's influence, we were working with them. We had all the screens, so all the films in between the bands were ours, and we branded the stage with the wheel. And it was Chris Martin and it was Ed Sheeran and it was Beyonce. I mean, Beyonce. And there's a picture of me and Kate, my co-founder, looking like competition winners, like enormous beams on our faces, like a photo, like with us and the wheel.
This is the ultimate competition, Gail. Come on.
We literally look like sort of 19-year-olds who've been given a free ticket. It was so fun. So that means that was an immense high. And then, immediately get a phone call on the wire saying like, oh my God, someone's backstage and they're drunk. And we're like, oh shit. And that sort of characterizes the journey all the time. Like you have these enormous, like, just as you think you've got a second to go, brilliant. You suddenly you're back in the room. And there's a sort of, I suppose that in that tricky second album thing that I mentioned earlier about, okay, now I don't know what we're going to do next. We had a meeting the next morning with one of the Gates founders saying, what are you going to do? And Kate and I had to immediately make something up on the spot, which was fine. But in the second year, it was harder. The first year we'd been running on fumes, running on adrenaline. And now I've worked with more entrepreneurs and started more businesses myself. I see the cycle. That second year is really hard. You've done your raise, you've burnt through your first cash. You're not new anymore. We were having to operationalize, fundraise for something that wasn't new anymore, grow without meaning to. And so we had a really difficult second year where we nearly went under. We nearly went bust. We nearly just had to stop trading. It was just too hard. And it was that partnership with the Gates Foundation and that boldness again. I mean, Kate, my co-founder Kate, is so bold. She's not a risk taker like me in that sense, but she's really brave and determined. And she saw a gap in the market when the Clinton Global Initiative, which is this big event that happened every year in New York, and then when Hillary Clinton declared she's going to run for the presidency, it couldn't happen anymore. So there was a sort of gap of a gathering point where power, celebrity, like purpose all came together publicly. And she said, we could fill that. And I was like, no, we couldn't. We're just us in London. They're ridiculous. We're practically bankrupt. She's like, no, I think we could. Let's talk to Gates, and so on. And thus, this amazing partnership called Goalkeepers was born, which was enough of an injection of a sort of steady client partnership foot in the, in the landscape to give us that validity to carry on. And then I think the rest has been a steady growth. But I mean, and then there's been ups and downs all the way through. But that is a classic kind of massive up, almost fail, back in. And what it taught me is the entrepreneur that I am an entrepreneur actually, because I'm resilient. I can ride those out. In fact, I quite enjoy them. And that and I said to Kate, there was a point much later in our career where there was a tricky thing just because of a global situation going on. I said, how do you cope with this stress? And she said, oh, it's politics. She said, when you're in politics, because she worked for Tony Blair for years, she said, when you're in politics, it can be appalling. The news cycle can just be terrible. But what you know is that then these things too will pass, and that there'll be a time when it's not like this, and you just have to dig in. So I think that's, I've learned so much from her, working with her so closely for over the years. But yeah, lots of roller coasters like that.
Total amazing sound advice. And I often think the same around, this too shall pass. It's something my mum always keeps reciting to me. So there you go. Thanks, Mum. The one thing that I could have potentially, possibly thought and conceived of that mega high that you described, in that moment, incredible out of body experience, as you call it. But geez, I would never have fathomed the year 2 that you described there. I mean, it would almost be like this would be something that prolongs, that continues, that thrives, and actually that's not reality. And that's kind of interesting in that sense. And
I think it's the power of newness, like when we were new and the goals were new, you get a long way on that. That gives you momentum.
yeah,
And then as soon as you're not new, annoyingly, issues, I've definitely noticed this over the last 10 years, issues are fashionable, issues are cyclical. We go to Davos every year, the World Economic Forum. One year it's AI, the next year it's cryptocurrency, the next year, no one's talked about women for a while. Now it's sustainability. And the celebrity come in and the money comes in. So we in totality were the new thing, like the SDGs were new. And then when they weren't, you had to back it up with a bit more process and a bit more, lay some tracks down rather than just explosion.
Mm-hmm. So, boy, do we need them. World's gone a bit bonkers of late. Where are we? What 10 years on or so? What's your perspective?
Well, I mean, this is the conversation, right? I think if you'd asked us 12 months ago, we were planning for, and we had been planning for quite some time, what does the 10-year mark look like? As you turn the corner, 5 years to go, do you do a countdown? Do you pick certain goals that might be achievable and really race into those? We knew they weren't on track. They're not on track. Conflict, climate change, all sorts of things if politics had happened before let's call it the special situation we're in now, to make, particularly conflict, I think, war in Ukraine, that was not foreseen when the goals were planned. War in Sudan, war in the Yemen, like conflict really knackers goal progress on so many different levels. But we were definitely seeing progress in other goals, enough to have gone in on quite a positive, come on guys, 5 more years to go, we got this. There was a whole campaign which may still have some relevance, but it needs to be thought through, because then there was the change in circs on the global scene. Really fundamental shifts we're seeing right now. I cannot emphasize enough what a shock to just the fundamentals of everything we have all ever known to be true and to be in place have shifted. It is like an earthquake. And whether that's looking at USAID being cancelled, I mean, that is catastrophic for people who've relied on that. Whether we should have gotten into a situation where people were so reliant on that or not, the way in which it has been removed is catastrophic, seismic, if you are in any shape or form reliant on that system for your life or your work or your income. Looking at allegiances right now, looking at what behaviors in one part of the world signal and validate, therefore, everywhere else. This is going to be an unfolding shock. And you've had the US ambassador stand up in the UN and said, we believe the goals should be cancelled because they are not aligned to American values. So we're in a very different landscape. All I can offer to people is the idea that nothing is as it was. Do not assume that anything that has previously been normal or kind of expected or predictable is going to be thus going forward. But use this moment, therefore, to really dig down on what it is you were working on, what you want to happen. You might have to. Someone said to me, when the weather changes, you put different clothes on. In the winter, you might you have to wear a coat, but you still go to work. So the work is still to be done, and I think there will. God knows what we're speaking today as the tariffs do or don't get rolled out around the world at different levels. So there's definitely some turbulence and some chop going on. We are in the rough seas for sure in terms of my work, but the work is still going on. And in many cases, the work makes good sense. It makes good economic sense. It certainly makes good social sense. So I think as people learn to adjust and adapt to these current stormy conditions, we'll find new boats. We'll find new maps, and we'll chart different courses perhaps to the same end game. But it's going to be rough. I mean, dig in, be resilient, expect nothing, and just work out who your allies are, because we're there, but it's tough. it's definitely tough. So for Project Everyone and the goals, huge determination, I'd say, from anyone who's working in this system to keep going. But right now, huge challenges, defunded, in some cases legislated against progress. So it's tough. It's really, really hard.
It paints such a sort of a stark contrast to some of the optimism that we've had in years gone by. I love your analogy, by the way, around the clothes, changing of the clothes, and still having to go to work.
I have to thank Tola Daniels for that, in case she ever listens. She said that to me at Davos. We were in Davos this year as the inauguration had happened, and then the exec, the big felt pen was coming out and signing things. And so people were like reeling on the hour almost of like, oh God, didn't think it would be that bad, not this quick. And Tola's a friend from New York, and she gave me that lovely quote. It's good, isn't it? I've used it a lot. Yeah.
I love it. The one thing that I reflect on is the fact that nothing is forever in what we're describing. And you say, and I love, by the way, the honesty around fashionable causes, because that is so bloody true.
Yeah.
And it's annoyingly true. Beyond that, but the thing that I'd always thought of was the symbolism. It almost enshrines it in a bit of a sense of set in stone. These are the top 17 things that really are important to humanity in that way. And I wonder if over time you've had a sense of reflection and kind of going, well, maybe this one could adapt, or this one could evolve, or could we put another one in the mix? Or has there been any thought around the evolution of the 17 enshrined principles?
Oh, there certainly has been. But I think the feeling has always been, I mean, obviously this is not for us to change, but just being in and around the conversations, the most common held addition that has been proposed is, should there be a connectivity goal about, and there was debate about the 18th goal would be internet for all. But it was very, very hotly debated and resisted in some quarters of the world who did not want everyone to be connected. So the whole thing was, can you imagine, an enormous negotiation, like what is in, what's out. So that's the only thing I've ever heard. There have been pushbacks from certain member states along the way saying, actually, these are just too hard, we're not going to get there. But I think the feeling was, and always has remained, if you start changing, even if it's at one target level, that's it, the dam's open. And do you then get major players coming in saying, actually, gender never liked that one, or equalities never liked that one. So I think it was felt, it's good. Richard always used to say, look, it's a plan. It may not be perfect, but it's a plan. And if you have a plan, it's better than not having a plan. And if everyone follows one plan, then you've got more chance of making some progress than everyone following a different bit of their own plan. In fact, he did a really great, one of the earliest films we made, which is a series of shortcuts of excerpts from films where someone says, we have a plan. I have a plan. I love everything about that plan. You have a plan? And, so I think as plans go, it's pretty good. It may not be perfect, but I think if you start undoing bits and bobs, the interesting thing, actually, one thing I would say there has been genuine debate over, and I think it would have been a good point, but especially as given where we are now, maybe good we didn't get there. But the gender goal 5, very much meant women and girls. If you read it, it's about women and girls. And we've seen this tremendous and I think very positive opening up of that term. What does it mean? Transgender, all sorts of, which simply just was not in the discussion. If it was not in the public discourse in 2015, 2016. So there have been some good challenges in that one, which is, what does gender actually mean these days? But I think for many parts of the world, that it's already hard enough to wrap their bonds around women should be equal. If you then start putting in all the other ones in there, you might face resistance from some of the more traditional countries or religious countries. And now, the context would be really challenging. So that was something that I think held some space, but good debate. It was, I think the goal was useful to force that debate.
Yeah. Gosh, we've run out of time, unfortunately. So I'm just thinking, what's the best wrap to this? You've covered so much, you've achieved so much, and I'm tempted to ask, what's your biggest reflections from the past? But actually, I'm not going to go for that. I'm going to go for what are you optimistic for the future, for yourself and for the world? What's your greatest source of optimism?
My greatest source of optimism at the moment, I think there's sort of two things. And actually, I could be really cheesy and just link them back to people and planet, because that is actually what they are. I'm hugely optimistic in the power of people. I feel like if you're looking at things that are going on in the world right now that you're not happy with, it's always really important to remember that there'll be many, many, many millions of people who are not happy, even though their leader might be doing something. And I feel like we're getting to a state of play. I mean, look at what's going on the streets of Istanbul at the moment. You know, people will come together, I think, and will resist the worst of times. I believe that. And you don't have to get on a plane and join a protest in Istanbul to resist. You know, you can do that in your own room, family, community, with your friends. So I think people will get through this if they are brave and connecting to other people. I think my source of inspiration, especially if you think about which goal I'm into at the moment, is nature, is the natural world. I feel like it's personally deeply healing always. I'm a creature of the sea and the rivers and the forests, and and I think people are beginning to understand that we all are, and that more time in nature is happier times. And so I'm doing a lot of deep work into nature financing, nature communications, and I'm doing an enormous project in September, which is that's going to be my next big thing, really, which you'll see when that's out. So nature, but I think powered by people. We are nature, so they shouldn't be two separate things, but that's where I'm at.
Gail, it's been tremendous talking to you today. It's been fantastic. What an epic journey that you've had, really. And it's been super inspiring. And I know so many people are going to take so much away from both the anecdotes as well as some of the key lessons learned. So it's just a delight to have had you on. And thank you for making the time.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Gail.